Imagine being alive for 9 centuries. Not 90 years. Not 100. 969 years. You would watch children become grandparents. You would watch cities rise and disappear. You would watch entire generations enter the world believing they had forever, only to discover that forever belonged to no one. And somewhere in the earliest pages of the Bible, there is a man who supposedly lived longer than anyone else. His name was Methuselah, 969 years. But here is the strange part. The Bible does not give him a great speech. It does not describe him conquering kingdoms. It does not tell us about a mighty army. It barely tells us anything at all. Instead, Genesis gives us a genealogy, a father, a son, a grandson, and then one number, 969. Why would an ancient text preserve the lifespan of a man whose story is almost completely silent? And why does his life sit directly beside the story of Enoch, the man who walked with God, and Noah, the man who survived the flood? Maybe Methuselah's story was never supposed to be about what he conquered. Maybe it was about what he witnessed, because sometimes the most powerful story is not the story of the man who changes history. It is the story of the man who lives long enough to watch history change around him. Before Methuselah, there was Enoch, and before Enoch, there was Jared, and before Jared, the genealogy of Genesis reaches backward through generation after generation until it arrives at Adam. Genesis chapter 5 presents a chain of fathers and sons. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and finally, Noah. This is not a conventional adventure story. It is a family line, a record of generations, a bridge between the first man and the man who would survive the flood. Scholars have noted that biblical genealogies can function not merely as family records, but also as literary structures that connect major figures and compress enormous stretches of time. And Methuselah stands almost exactly at the center of this bridge. He is not presented as a king, not a prophet, not a warrior. He is presented as a son, Enoch's son, and eventually, Lamech's father, and Noah's grandfather. That sounds ordinary, until we reach the number 969. That number changes everything. Genesis tells us that when Enoch was 65 years old, he became the father of Methuselah, and then something remarkable happens. The text says Enoch walked faithfully with God for another 300 years. Then Genesis says Enoch was no more, because God took him away. Methuselah therefore grows up under the shadow of a father whose relationship with God became one of the strangest episodes in Genesis. Imagine that family. A father remembered not primarily because of how long he lived, but because of how he lived, and a son who would become famous for how long he lived. Enoch lived 365 years. Methuselah, more than 6 centuries separated those numbers. But the Bible gives us no record of Methuselah reacting to his father's disappearance. No farewell, no final conversation, no explanation. And this is where any movie about Methuselah must be careful. We can imagine the emotion. We cannot claim the Bible recorded it. So picture only the possibility. A young Methuselah looking toward the place his father once walked. A family asking questions. A son growing older without the father who had shaped his earliest years. And perhaps this is the first tragedy of Methuselah's life. Not death, but absence. At 187 years old, Methuselah became the father of Lamech. And Genesis gives us a detail that becomes crucial. Methuselah then lived another 782 years. He had other sons and daughters. And then, the text gives the final number. 969 years. That is the biblical record. No other person in Genesis is assigned a longer lifespan. Jared reaches 962. Noah lives 950. Adam lives 930. Seth lives 912. But Methuselah, for modern audiences, the number is almost impossible to visualize. So imagine a world where a great-grandfather could remember events from the childhood of his own great-grandfather. Imagine a family gathering, And the oldest person alive could remember generations that everyone else knew only through stories. But there is something darker about extraordinary longevity. The longer you live, the more people you can lose. Methuselah's life would eventually become a procession of funerals. If we follow the ages recorded in Genesis as a literal chronological sequence, generation after generation around him dies, while Methuselah continues. That is the emotional paradox at the heart of his story. Living longer does not necessarily mean losing less. Sometimes, it means losing more. The world of Genesis was changing. Genesis 6 describes humanity increasing upon the earth, and describes widespread wickedness and violence. The text's atmosphere changes dramatically. The genealogy has ended. The warning has begun, and Methuselah is still alive. His grandson Noah is growing older. His son Lamech has become a father, and the world around them is becoming increasingly violent. The biblical narrative does not tell us exactly what Methuselah personally thought about this decline. But we know one thing. He lived through the generation immediately before the flood, and his family was about to become central to one of the Bible's greatest catastrophes. Noah is described differently from the world around him. Genesis presents him as righteous and walking with God, and God tells Noah to build an ark. The world does not believe him. That creates the thematic underdog story. Not a warrior facing an army, but one family standing against an entire civilization. Not David against Goliath, but faith against impossible odds. When Lamech was 182 years old, he became the father of a son. He called him Noah. Lamech connected the name with comfort, with relief from the painful labor of the cursed ground. And Methuselah was Noah's grandfather. Think about that. The man with the longest lifespan in the biblical record stood only one generation away from the man who would build the ark. The Bible does not tell us whether Methuselah helped Noah. It does not describe a conversation between them. It does not tell us whether Methuselah ever touched the ark. Those details belong to imagination, not scripture. But the chronology creates an extraordinary connection. Methuselah's lifespan reaches almost to the flood. According to the traditional Masoretic chronology, Methuselah's death is placed in the same year as the flood. This chronology is based on the numerical data of Genesis and later Jewish chronological traditions. Other ancient textual traditions calculate the genealogical numbers differently. That distinction matters, because the popular claim, Methuselah died 7 days before the flood, is not actually stated in Genesis. It comes from later interpretive traditions. The biblical text simply says, Methuselah lived 969 years, and then he died. Imagine watching the world change, while knowing that your family has been warned. The ark rises, the animals gather, the rain approaches, and around Noah, people continue living as if tomorrow will look exactly like today. That is one of the most frightening ideas in the flood story. Not the rain, not the thunder, but the ordinary confidence of people who believe tomorrow is guaranteed. Methuselah had already lived longer than anyone else. He had seen generations disappear. He had learned something everyone eventually learns. Tomorrow is never promised. For Noah, the challenge was obedience. For Methuselah, the challenge was time. And that makes his story strangely powerful.
No sword, no throne.
No army. No miracle described directly. Just time. 1 year. Then another. Then another. Century after century. Until the world reaches its breaking point. Then the sky changes. The rain begins. The first, perhaps it sounds almost harmless, drops against the earth. A storm. Another storm. But Genesis describes something far greater. The waters rise. The flood begins. Noah enters the ark with his family, and the world outside disappears beneath the waters. This is where the movie reaches its visual climax. But Methuselah should not suddenly become a fictional action hero. He does not appear in Genesis commanding soldiers. He does not fight giants. He does not rescue cities. His power is something far quieter. He is the witness to a world that existed before Noah, the witness to the generations that came before. the witness to the final days of the old world. And finally, the witness whose own life comes to an end. Water covers the land. The old world is gone, and Noah survives. There is a strange irony in Methuselah's story. For 969 years, death waited, but it never forgot him. No matter how long he lived, he was still mortal, and that is the true turning point. Methuselah did not defeat death. He simply delayed the meeting, for centuries, for almost a millennium, but eventually, the longest life still reaches its final line. Genesis says, Methuselah lived 969 years, and then he died. That's it. No final speech. No mandament. No battlefield. Just death. And perhaps that silence is deliberate, because the genealogy keeps repeating the same rhythm. He lived, he had children, and he died. Again, and again, and again. The repeated ending becomes the message. Even 969 years cannot make a human immortal. After Methuselah, the story belongs to Noah. Noah's family leaves the ark. The waters recede. The earth begins again, and God establishes a covenant with Noah. The flood story becomes one of Scripture's great images of judgment and renewal. But Methuselah remains behind in the genealogy, a name connecting two worlds, the world before the flood and the world after it. And this is where his life becomes more meaningful than the number. Methuselah represents continuity, generation after generation, father to son, son to grandson, grandson to descendants. He is part of the chain that leads from Adam to Noah, and eventually into the later biblical story. The genealogy is not merely a list of names. It is a statement. Human history continues. But now we reach the question modern audiences always ask. Could a human being really live 969 years? The Bible presents the number as part of its antediluvian genealogy. Modern science does not provide evidence that humans can naturally live anywhere near that age. So this documentary should not present 969 years as scientifically established fact. Instead, we should ask what the biblical number is doing inside the story. Ancient traditions from the ancient Near East also contain extraordinarily long lifespans and reigns, and scholars have debated how biblical genealogical numbers function within their literary and chronological systems. There are different interpretations. Some readers understand the ages literally. Others see symbolic or literary functions. And different ancient textual traditions preserve different chronological figures. What remains undisputed within the biblical text itself is this. Genesis assigns Methuselah the extraordinary age of 969 years. And regardless of how someone interprets the number, the message is haunting. You can have almost 1,000 years, and still, UD. Methuselah has no famous battle, no palace, no empire, no speech recorded for history, yet his name survived thousands of years. Why? Because his story asks one of humanity's oldest questions. What would you do if you knew you had more time? Would you build? Would you love? Would you forgive? Would you waste it? Methuselah lived longer than anyone else named in the biblical genealogy. But longevity was not immortality. And that distinction matters today, because we live in an age obsessed with extending life. We measure years. We study aging. We search for cures. We dream of slowing the clock. But the ancient story of Methuselah reminds us of something simpler. The value of life is not measured only by its length. It is measured by what happens inside it. Methuselah lived 969 years. But Genesis gives us almost none of those years. And perhaps that is the final lesson. History remembers numbers. God's story remembers people. The man who lived 969 years eventually died. His son died. His grandson Noah survived the flood. And the human story continued, generation after generation, until the name Methuselah became more than an ancient name. It became a symbol of time, of mortality, of memory, and of the strange truth that even the longest human life is still only a moment against eternity. If this story made you look at time differently, subscribe. because there are thousands of forgotten names in ancient history, and behind many of them is a story waiting to be uncovered.